1994, when we were only about 4 months away from meeting our contractual deadline to finish the manuscript, the Republicans swept to victory. This was certainly an historical moment. For the first time in 40 years, the Republicans were in charge of the House and the Senate. The contract with America was on everyone's lips. Everyone was talking about Newt Gingrich. The political world had shifted dramatically. But there we were, George and I, exhausted, fed up with the book, and with the finish line in sight. We were determined not to let this dramatic change affect our book too much. You know, we said, okay, sure, we'll beef up the last chapter, and we'll do something more with the prologue and the introduction, and you know, maybe make that last chapter a very special chapter. But early in the year, it was clear to our publisher, certainly, and most of our friends, that something had to be done. I remember I was sitting in the Senate press gallery one morning, and David Rogers from the Wall Street Journal walked over and said, "So, how is the outcome of the election going to affect your book?" I said, "Oh, no problem. I mean, we're just going to, you know, tinker on the margins, and you know, we'll probably do you know, a big last chapter, one big chapter to deal with it." And there was this pause, and he said, "One chapter?" And then he raised his eyebrow and he said, "Are you sure just one chapter?" As if to say, "Hey, bub, get serious. There's more work in your future than that." That July, Times Books confirmed those suspicions, and we were told we had to write an entirely different book that focused on the Republican Revolution and what it was doing to the budget. They, like everyone else, were confident that there was going to be a balanced budget agreement. I guess we didn't fully appreciate at the time that the Republican takeover was really a blessing in disguise. It was certainly a much better story to report, and it made for a much better book. While we were concerned that all of our years of research, and we spent a lot of time delving into supply-side economics back in the early 80s after Reagan took over, and the impact of Reagan's policies and the defense buildup and scores of other factors in creating the big modern era deficits that politicians were struggling with. We looked into that. George was very interested in the 1990 budget summit, which was the last time there was a major effort by Republicans and Democrats to try to do something about the deficit, although it cost President Bush dearly. We had spent a lot of time looking into all these stories, and they were fascinating stories, and we were concerned that suddenly we were going to have to jettison all that work and just do a book on the Republican Revolution, as interesting as that was. But as we got into it more deeply, we realized that to understand what was going on today, we really had to understand the history of this. And so all of that research became the spine of the book, and all of that history was very important. But what we had to do as journalists was to look at all that through the prism of what was happening this year, 1995, 1996. And as writers, this is perhaps the most important lesson that we learned, that it wasn't enough just to interview, you know, hundreds of people and read history books and debrief people on meetings and stuff like that. All that stuff's important, but in the end, you basically had to take that material in hand and do something with it, massage it, use it to drive your notions of deficit politics, and in the end, if you can do that, you can tell a much larger story. As I say, remarkably, most of the issues we began to deal with in 1995 simply echoed the issues that we had been studying before we ran into the Republican Revolution, and a determined publisher who wanted a very different book. And all of those events became the backdrop for what unfolded in 1995, when a determined Republican Party took over and tried to impose its vision on Washington and the rest of the country. Newt Gingrich, Dick Armey, Tom DeLay, and others mistakenly, we think, thought that they were dealing with a wishy-washy, kind of wimpish Democratic president. The Republicans came in believing that they could make President Clinton bow to them through the threat of closing down the government if necessary. And it's interesting, the Republicans did sort of a personality profile of the president shortly after they took office, much as the FBI would sort of do a profile of a serial killer or something like that, just sort of going back and figuring the guy out. And their conclusion was, in the face of a threatened shutdown, the president would cave. Okay. Thank you. It was a huge drama that culminated in high-profile budget talks at the White House that eventually collapsed in January of 1996. And what was so interesting and so ironic was that Clinton emerged from the wreckage looking masterful, and the Republicans were confused and demoralized. One of the reasons we wanted to do this book was that we saw that the Republicans had fallen victim to the same trap that had ensnared many who came before them. I think the popular attitude toward Washington's deficit problem was that it would be easy to fix it. You know, if only those idiots in Washington could get their acts together. I mean, what's the problem? Bill Clinton came to Washington thinking the same thing. He had been governor in Arkansas, and he had balanced the budget. Of course, there was a law that made it a crime for him not to, and of course, the pressures were much different. But he was confident that you know, within a year or two, he could whip that budget into shape. They were all sort of seduced by the notion that they were smarter than anyone else, that they could fix what no one else could. I think one of our favorite examples of this was Ross Perot, who had declared during the 1992 presidential campaign that he had a simple plan that would fix the deficit. We were so taken with this guy's amazing hubris and his precipitous fall when it turned out he hadn't the slightest idea what he was talking about. I mean, we talked to some of his people who helped him put together his grand schemes for balancing the budget, and they were always saying after meetings with Ross, you know, they scratched their head and said, you know, how could this guy know so little about the budget and yet pretend to know so much? And we were so taken with this that the original title for the book was not Mirage, but it was Without Breaking a Sweat, which was something that Perot used to say, as in, hey, I can fix that that deficit without breaking a sweat. Actually, George does a much better imitation of Ross Perot than I did, and he amused me many nights while we were working on this book with his imitation.
Yes, he did, and that was at 1 o'clock in the morning. What may have been funny at 1 o'clock in the morning.
I thought it was right.
We thought it was hilarious at 1 a.m. I'm going to skip that tonight. The thing that we found over and I knew that'd be a popular decision. The thing that we found over and over and over again was that it wasn't just Ross Perot. It's almost anybody with a big ego who comes to Washington and thinks, gee, you know, that problem isn't so difficult. I mean, Ronald Reagan came and he said, I can handle this. He promised to balance the budget, and he said it's going to be easy. In fact, it was fairly destructive the way he framed it for all his successors, because he said this is really easy. All you have to do is cut fraud, waste, and abuse and go after welfare queens and so on, and bingo, you've solved the problem. But as Eric points out, the best example in our book of a guy who really thought he could handle this was Bill Clinton, who had told his associates when he was governor of Arkansas, you know, this is not rocket science. This is not that difficult. If I can do it in Arkansas, why can't the federal government do it in Washington? And nobody learned more painfully, which is one of our favorite parts of the book and why I wrote the 147-page chapter, to show this. As he comes, he's a brand new president, 1993. He's convinced by a variety of people that the one thing he's got to do before he can do anything else is to come up with a serious deficit reduction program. And remember, this isn't balancing the budget. This is just cutting the deficit in half over 4 years. So he brings this thing to a Congress, which, by the way, is a Democratic Congress. First Democratic president in 12 years. You'd think it'd be a fairly friendly venue for him to go to. And he has what even some of his sympathetic colleagues called a near-death experience. He came within a single vote in both the House and the Senate of losing this thing. Al Gore had to go up to the Capitol Hill twice to break ties in the Senate, and if Marjorie Margolis-Mizvinsky hadn't essentially sacrificed her career to vote for this thing, he would have lost it. It's very, very difficult to do, and it was this kind of a story that convinced us, maybe there's some compelling stories here. Let me just digress for a second and say that when you're writing a book, I don't know how many other authors have had this experience, it's great when you're in a conversation, because people will always say, so what are you up to lately? And you say, well, I'm writing a book. And they say, really? And the light kind of goes on in their face, and they say, what's it about? And unfortunately, Eric and I would have to say, well, it's about the budget deficit. And then before we could explain that it's really a compelling, fascinating story, they'd say, Oh, really? I think I left the stove on, but good luck with that book about the deficit. Of course, there is this widespread and absolutely incorrect notion that the budget is dull. Anybody who would like us has covered it for years and years. We wouldn't be doing this. We're not crazy. It's actually very compelling. This is where the nation, obviously, to be grand about it, works out the clashes of strongly held beliefs. And also, the people who get to fight about this, especially in Washington, are some of the best and most interesting politicians you'll find anywhere. This provokes great stuff, often great drama. One of our favorite scenes in the book that used to be at the beginning of the book until the Republicans took over the Congress in '94 and forced us to rewrite it, was the scene when Dan Rostenkowski, who was, before he was a federal prisoner, was the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, and he went in August of 1989 home to Chicago, to his congressional district, to defend something called the Medicare Catastrophic Coverage Act. And for anybody who doesn't remember what that is, I'll give you a small and oversimplified explanation. It extended Medicare coverage, but in exchange there was a surtax paid mostly theoretically by wealthier people. And at the time, a lot of people in the country got the idea that they were going to have to pay this tax, even if they were middle-class people at whom the tax was not aimed. And it became a very unpopular, enormously unpopular and controversial program. A lot of interest groups kind of fanned the flames and misinformed people. And anyway, Rostenkowski goes back in the middle of this atmosphere, a very angry atmosphere, to his home district in Chicago during the August recess, and he's trying to explain this. He's not making any headway. He's at a senior center in downtown Chicago, and he decides, I got to get out of here. And he goes out to his car where his driver is waiting, a big four-door Caprice, and he jumps in and he tells the driver, get me out of here. And unfortunately, in the time it took him to get into the car, the protesters have surrounded the car, and they've taken their placards, which say things like liar and impeach and Rottenkowski and jerk, and also you can get an idea of the tenor of this proceeding. And they're starting to beat on the car, and a woman named Leona Kosian, this nice woman with heart-shaped glasses who's never done anything like this before in her life, crawls up on the hood of the car. And pretty soon she's got her face right up against the windshield, and she's eyeball to eyeball with Rostenkowski, who's not a small man. He was a large, sometimes very intimidating guy. But Kosian later told reporters, she said, I was scared, but I could tell looking at his eyes, he was even more scared than I was. And he jumps out of the car and runs down the street, and you can imagine this thing is all caught on TV, with Dan Rostenkowski running down the street and these protesters waving their placards saying, you bum, you liar, get out of here. This was the kind of thing that we thought if we could write a book like this, it might actually work.
But I think it was the poignant moments that haunted us the most in writing the book. Bob Dole was a central character throughout our research and throughout our writing. He's perhaps one of the most intriguing politicians that we came across in doing all this. And he really struck us as being a man torn between his better instincts about what needed to be done about the deficit, a problem that he helped to create back in the early 80s, and what he needed to do to try to advance his own political career when he ran for president again and again. There was no better example of this, I think, than when he tried to get the balanced budget amendment through the Senate in early 1995. You all may remember this that battle. Gingrich had already pushed it through the House, and Dole now had to show that he was a revolutionary leader too. He was kind of a can-do guy who could get tough legislation through and thus deserved to be the Republican presidential nominee. But the Senate was really a very different place than the House, and Dole was a very different kind of leader than Gingrich. Leading the Senate was, I think the best way of describing it is trying to herd cats. I mean, you've got 99 other very independent-minded politicians, each with his own agenda, each with enormous power to essentially bring the institution to a standstill, and certainly to block legislation that they don't like. Now, don't get me wrong, Bob Dole was no shrinking violet, but he was reluctant on very tough votes to make a personal appeal to members, particularly people he had worked with, colleagues he had worked with for many years. Dole never left any doubt how he wanted his members to vote, but he was reticent really to kind of twist arms. Sometimes he used humor or a nod or a grunt or something to sort of get across his point. For example, if he were to come across a member in the hallway who he knew was opposing an amendment that Dole wanted very badly, rather than buttonholing him and talking his ear off the way Lyndon Johnson might have done, for example, Dole would go, aye, aye, as in vote aye when the time comes. Senators were wondering, what is with this guy? But that was sort of Dole's style. Mark Hatfield, who served with Dole for a quarter century, remembered it as all light touches with this marvelous humor that he has. But with the balanced budget amendment, it was a very different situation. Dole had to get it passed. He believed that his presidential aspirations really hung on the outcome of that vote, and that losing it would be a terrible and perhaps politically fatal embarrassment. And here was Mark Hatfield, a fellow Republican, longtime friend, chairman of the Appropriations Committee. He was the one person really standing in the way of passage of the balanced budget amendment. Dole needed one more vote to get the two-thirds majority that was needed on the constitutional amendment. The Democrats were all locked into their position. If Hatfield could be persuaded to change his vote, they could get the 67th vote and pass the constitutional amendment. So it was an incredibly important moment for Dole. And this is what we wrote. In the privacy of Hatfield's office, deep in the elaborate appropriations suite, Dole now openly pleaded with his friend to change his mind. Mark, Dole said, this is going to be a reflection on your leader. Dole told him how important it was to him in his run for the presidential nomination. If he lost this vote, it could be crushing to his campaign, which was built on the notion that he was a leader who could get things done. Isn't there any way you could do this? Dole begged him. The ordinarily private and self-contained Dole had never appealed to him on such personal grounds, never made himself so vulnerable. It was the most personal conversation the two men had had in a quarter century together in the Senate, and Hatfield felt terrible anguish at having to say no. They talked through the options, such as Hatfield simply ducking the vote, but the Oregon senator said he could not do that either. Dole seemed more and more distressed. Then Hatfield stunned Dole. He said, there is an option. That is, I'll write up my resignation from the Senate. You'll have 66 of 99 votes. That's two-thirds of the majority. You'll pass the bill. Dole reacted at first as if he didn't understand. It was an extraordinary sacrifice. Hatfield was willing to walk away from the office he had held for 28 years, give up the chairmanship of one of the most powerful committees in Congress, go into retirement just as Republicans were on the verge of remaking government, all to bail out his friend and spare the party the embarrassment of losing the vote. When Dole gathered his wits, he said firmly, of course not. I wouldn't consider that. That's not an option. There was now no doubt where Hatfield stood. Characteristically, Dole sought to lighten things again as he stood up. Well, we're still a half hour away from the vote, Dole said wryly. Maybe you'll change your mind. After Dole left, Hatfield felt deeply moved. We wear masks around here so much, he said later. For someone literally to take off their mask and say, here I am in a vulnerable position, I think is probably the highest tribute one human can extend to another human being. When some other human being says, I need you, I desperately rely upon you at this point, is of such vital importance to me. It was a moment of anguish that I treasured. Here was this man really so open, so real, so sincere. I had a reaction for days after, like someone hit in the stomach.
I just want to leave you with one more thing before we wrap it up. Eric likes those poignant scenes. I like the violent ones. And there's one other thing. Can you tell we've shifted from, for a while you're an author and it's very pure and it's sublime and you're locked away in your attic and writing, and then you get out and you become a naked self-promoter. It's terrible. We had one other thing, at the very end of the budget negotiations, 95, 96, it's January 96, it's cold outside, everybody's exhausted, they've been doing this for months, they have a sense that it's not going to work, that the Republicans and Democrats alike are exhausted and tired, but the Republicans are even more tired, frustrated, angry, and annoyed even at each other, and they're bickering and fighting and so on and so forth. Oval Office one day, There's an offer on the table, and the Republicans get up and they say, okay, we're going to go out and talk about this. And they go out and they caucus for a while, and a while turns into a longer while, and they're out, and hours go by, and the Democrats get the sense that the Republicans are out there on purpose, staying out just to try to make the Democrats sweat. You know, if you've ever bought a car, you know, at some point the car salesman gets up and walks away, and he's away for 20 minutes and half an hour. At any rate, the Republicans were fighting among themselves. They were yelling at each other, and there was an unhappy kind of a camp at that point. They were trying to decide how far to go, whether their tactics were correct, and they were probably wondering at the time what the Democrats were doing in the Oval Office while they were waiting for them to come back, and thinking, you know, maybe we hope they're really discussing their tactics and thinking maybe we did the wrong thing. In fact, what we found out happened was that as soon as the Republicans walked out the door, Clinton called up and ordered some popcorn. He flipped on the TV. He turned to the American Movie Classics channel, and he found a movie, a Western actually, called Rough Night in Jericho, starring Dean Martin, right, and Gene Simmons. And as the Republicans were waiting out there and trying to make them sweat, Clinton sat back, and they were all enjoying the movie, and Clinton kept saying, God, that Gene Simmons looks good, doesn't she? So with that, we'll be happy to take a few questions, and then we'll get to signing some books.
Why don't we encourage him? That's great. He's very polished. Have some water? There, you need water. Yeah. There's some seats up here. Why don't some of you come up? We have about 10, 12 seats up here. Come on in so you won't have to crowd back in the back. Don't be shy. We'll wait for you. Come on. We're going to stand here until some of you come up and sit down. It makes us uncomfortable to watch you all standing back there. There are loads of seats on the side. You can't see them from back there. There are more over here.
It's like shutting down the government.
I know, it's impossible.
You finally prevailed on my wife to come up. This is a good sign.
Yeah, that's good. There's seats here, there's seats over here. There's a lot of comfortable seats over here on the side here. Can I get some more of you to come up? All right.
Okay. Anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
Could you give us some idea about what percent of the federal budget the deficit constitutes? I mean, is that 160 billion deficit? Is it 1%? Is it 10.5?
If it were 160, it'd be about 10%. The federal budget runs roughly $1.6 trillion, 1.6 trillion. Now it's down to about $100 billion. And really the measurement that most economists like to use is they compare it. It's like having a mortgage, and you compare your mortgage to your income. And what they do is typically they compare the dollar figure is a lot less relevant than the comparison of the size of the deficit to the gross domestic product,
right,
which is a measure of the size of the economy. And now, interestingly enough, the deficit has come down to, in terms of that comparison, which sort of measures how affordable it is to the economy and to the nation at large, to about 1.4% of GDP, which means, translated, it's as low as it's been since Nixon was president.
But compared to the federal budget?
Compared to the federal budget now, let's see, what would be the 100? Can anybody do this math off the top of their head? If 160 out of 1.6 trillion is 10%, then the deficit would be, what, about 6%? Roughly 6% of the size of the federal budget is borrowed money, which is not gigantic, obviously. Yeah. The point being that it's getting pretty small.
Yes, sir.
Well, just following that up, as a debt owed by the American people, isn't it more meaningful to compare it to the gross domestic product?
In terms of the debt, the size of the overall debt?
No, the deficit. Is what I was
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. And and this is, again, the comparison that we use in the book a little bit is the size of a mortgage. And, you know, for a mortgage, obviously a $100,000 mortgage for Donald Trump is chicken feed. A $100,000 mortgage for somebody who's making $15,000 a year is a killer. So that's the relevant way to think about it, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Jen?
In your interviewing process, when you were talking about the main players, it seems that in terms of the deficit, the American public, in fact, is not a main player. Did you do any interviewing of whether your average Joe on the street gives a lick about the deficit.
Well, we looked at a lot of polling, and we found essentially a conflicted public. And I think this is one of the big challenges for politicians, and why they seem to be chasing their tail all the time on the deficit. Everyone is for a balanced budget, and everyone wants the government to live within its means, while most Americans, of course, don't. And this is a very plastic society, and everyone has a mortgage and a car loan and all this stuff. But they want the government to live within its means. Yet you ask them what sacrifices they're willing to make, and then, oh no, wait a minute, let's not get carried away. Don't touch my Social Security, don't touch my Medicare, don't touch my Medicaid, don't touch veterans' benefits, don't do this, don't get into that subsidy. And I think these mixed signals have made it very difficult for politicians over the years to basically pursue a coherent policy. It's much easier to cater to the whims and more venal instincts of their constituents than to sort of stick to their guns when they know in doing deficit reduction that all the political pain is now. I mean, you'll suffer the consequences almost immediately of your vote. The payoff, the benefit is long term. It may not be seen for 15 or 20 years. It's very subtle in some ways. It might affect the long-term standard of living, maybe it'll increase savings. I mean, there are all these things that are kind of nebulous when you want to know, well, what is the bottom line right now? So that's why it's very difficult for politicians to sort of commit themselves now to stuff that may not pay off for many years to come.
Jeff, did you?
I was going to ask you about the passage that you read, which I thought was very interesting, actually, and just sort of a writing research and question. It just seems to me there were probably only two people in the room at the time, and my guess is the source was not Bob Dole.
No,
So I'm sort of interested, was it hard to get this story from Hatfield or a staffer, or could he not wait to tell you this? I mean, it just
well, it was interesting. Dole alluded to it very briefly in a press conference or on Meet the Press or something like that, that he had talked to Hatfield in his office. And we had talked to some aides trying to get a sense of, what was going on. And, we felt it was vital to try to bring the story to life, and we didn't want to write sort of a dry textbook kind of thing. And so I spent a lot of time trying to arrange for an interview with Hatfield. Finally, I got the call, and I rushed to his office in the Capitol. And I was ushered in, and he was on the phone for about 15 minutes, and then he sat down. And he is really a lovely man. If you've ever met him, he's a real gentleman and very thoughtful. And I was sort of shocked by how frank he was. I was disarmed by it, and I said, well, I was kind of apologetic and sort of probing and asking, what really went on in that meeting. And he just sort of laid it out for me. And then he, in this very passionate way, and when I was done, I just couldn't believe it. And then George and I talked it over and over again, and we thought, we really have to bring this to life, because most people don't know that much about Bob Dole. I mean, I think he's a very difficult man to read, and we all covered him on the Hill, and in many ways he's inscrutable. I mean, he's great with one-line quips, but didn't. And while he held a lot of press conferences, he really didn't let his guard down, and so it was very difficult to get much out of him. I interviewed him several times for the book, and I can't say that any of them were really satisfactory types of interviews, because, well, for one thing, we were pressing him on trying to recall stuff that happened a long time ago. I mean, I don't know about you, I have trouble sometimes recalling what I did, 2 weeks ago, let alone, in 1981 when they were fighting over supply-side economics and all that. But also, he's a very cautious guy, and so I talked to him a little about it, but didn't get much from him. And then Hatfield just opened up. And so we had this wonderful scene, and we just sort of did as much with it as we could.
Yes?
Without approving or disapproving, why do you think Paul Saunders' approach was given so little attention?
During the campaign, for example?
During the campaign, or at
Paul
any
Saunders?
time. I mean,
Why why did people pay so little attention to what Paul Tsongas was talking about?
Well, not so much what he was talking about, but the approach that he and his committee.
Coalition.
Well, I think that those Paul Tsongas and members of the Concord Coalition are true budget hawks, deficit hawks, and they firmly believe that the biggest problem facing America today is a runaway deficit. Of course, the deficit has gone down in recent years. It seems less of a threat, although certainly if you look at the projections in the coming century, it's kind of alarming how the deficit will shoot up unless Congress does something more on entitlements. But I think that Tsongas, who I think began his career as a liberal and then gradually became more and more conservative in his views, especially on tax policy, he was a big believer in the importance of tax breaks to stimulate the economy to help business, especially small business in his hometown. But also he believed, he believed fervently in this. And when he ran for president, he was in 1992. He was the only Democrat out there talking about the deficit problem and what needed to be done. Bill Clinton wasn't talking about it. He was running away from the issue. Bob Kerrey, another Democrat who was running for the Democratic nomination that year, told us, he stayed away from talking about the deficit. He said there were no applause lines in it. Why bother? There were no votes in it. I mean, who wants to run, particularly in a recessionary racked New England, during that campaign, talking about painful cuts that have to be made, increasing taxes on the middle class, cutting programs. All these things were not. They're not the things that help you get nominated president. But Tsongas sort of stuck to his guns, and early on it looked as if it was paying off. Early on it appeared as if frank talk really was paying off for him in New England. But after winning in New Hampshire in the Democratic primary, primarily because Clinton had so many problems of his own, sex scandals and stuff like that. Gradually, Clinton was able to bloody Tsongas by challenging him on a lot of his proposals and showing that these painful solutions that he was talking about were not all that popular with most Americans. Yep.
Do you have any reaction in the book, to the Forbes campaign?
No.
It came a little late for us to sort of incorporate that. I mean, that was more or less we kind of cut off the book in January of '96, and of course Forbes was active at the time, but we focused on the end game of the budget negotiations and then stopped. We were exhausted. So our next book will deal heavily with the Forbes campaign.
Maybe a couple more questions?
What's the size and what's the role of corporate welfare, however you define it?
I think that Congress, the Republican Party in particular, is struggling with this issue right now. I think that one of the problems is defining what corporate welfare is. I think that a lot of Republicans, including John Kasich, who are concerned that to be fair in dealing with a deficit, major businesses and special interests are going to have to bear their share of the burden. But I think the Republicans, for the most part, are trying to focus on spending programs and subsidies, but they're reluctant to go after some of the big tax breaks that help major corporations in promoting their products overseas or getting a leg up on research or the scores of other benefits. I think that you'll see probably more and more emphasis on it as a coalition around this begins to expand, but I don't expect to see any major inroads along those lines anytime soon. Yes.
George or Eric, it's clear that the Republicans weren't prepared as well politically for the shutdown, but in talking to the administration folks, did you get a sense from them that they were just waiting to hit this out of the park, or were they nervous as well? I mean, because it's clear that's the turning point.
You know, that's a very good question, and I don't know if we can satisfactorily answer that, despite having talked to a lot of people in the administration about that. I think they felt very concerned the first time through because they were in really terra incognita. They didn't know what was going on, and they were just as desperate to reopen government at that point during that first one around Thanksgiving, I think it was, right? November, right before Thanksgiving, in '95, as the Republicans were. I remember one time they said Leon Panetta came up desperately, frantically searching for John Kasich in the House gym and looking for him everywhere. And they were sitting around. The thing they were worried about, they hadn't gotten the poll results yet, which I think buoyed them considerably and made them rethink this whole strategy. But they were very worried because they were going to lose a vote in the House very soon. That first shutdown, they were going to lose control of their own people, and they were going to be embarrassed. In fact, the day that the language was faxed back from the Capitol, giving them a way out of the shutdown, they were sitting around sort of moping about how are we going to spin this? How are we going to, once we lose control of our own party in the House and they vote to reopen the government in some fashion, and we have a choice of whether or not to veto it, what are we going to do then? I think once they saw the poll results, of course, that showed them winning 2-1 in public opinion on that question of who caused the shutdown, they took a much decidedly more sanguine view.
One more question back there?
I just to follow up on that, I just had a question about how Medicare as a particular program seemed to generate, there seemed to be a lot of support among the polling respondents, at least, for that program. And yet now, and I remember thinking at the time how, there are real problems with Medicare and keeping it solvent over the course of several decades in the future. So how is Clinton, in his second term, which he now has, going to tackle this? And I read in the Post today, I think one of you wrote the story about how there's an $18 billion compromise. But I don't know if there are any details with regard to that. In other words, Clinton is having to grapple with making reductions in spending in Medicare.
Right. Well, I think everyone seems to agree that we have to do something about Medicare spending. There's still a big. The Republicans and Democrats still are very far apart on Medicare, not only on the numbers, but although the gap is decreasing, but also sort of the policy, how you go about doing it. I think the administration early on seemed anxious to do something in a big way about the problem short term and then long term. And there was talk, remember, of creating some kind of a commission, blue ribbon commission, to look at the long-term problems and come up with recommendations for restructuring it, while doing something this year to make sure that the system doesn't go bankrupt in the next several years. The whole idea of the commission has just sort of disappeared. I think Clinton, for the time being, is simply interested in doing just enough to get by. And there isn't a lot of enthusiasm on either side of the aisle to do anything dramatic on entitlements, on cost of living adjustments, the whole range of things that affect entitlement programs, seniors, and veterans groups. So I think you'll see some incremental steps along the way, but nothing bold. Politicians we're struggling with. We looked into that. George was very interested in the 1990 budget summit, which was the last time there was a major effort by Republicans and Democrats to try to do something about the deficit, although it cost President Bush dearly. We had spent a lot of time looking into all these stories, and they were fascinating stories, and we were concerned that suddenly we were going to have to jettison all that work and just do a book on the Republican Revolution, as interesting as that was. But as we got into it more deeply, we realized that to understand what was going on today, we really had to understand the history of this. And so all of that research became the spine of the book, and all that history was very important. But what we had to do as journalists was to look at all that through the prism of what was happening this year, 1995, 1996. And as writers, this is perhaps the most important lesson that we learned, that it wasn't enough just to interview, hundreds of people and read history books and debrief people on meetings and stuff like that. All that stuff's important, but in the end, you basically had to take that material in hand and do something with it, massage it, use it to drive your notions of deficit politics. And in the end, if you can do that, you can tell a much larger story. As I say, remarkably, most of the issues we began to deal with in 1995 simply echoed the issues that we had been studying before we ran into the Republican Revolution and the determined public suspicions, and we were told we had to write an entirely different book that focused on the Republican Revolution and what it was doing to the budget. They, like everyone else, were confident that there was going to be a balanced budget agreement. I guess we didn't fully appreciate at the time that the Republican takeover was really a blessing in disguise. It was certainly a much better story to report, and it made for a much better book. While we were concerned that all of our years of research, and we spent a lot of time delving into supply-side economics back in the early 80s after Reagan took over, and the impact of Reagan's policies and the defense build-up and scores of other factors in creating the big modern era deficits that maybe make that last chapter a very special chapter. But early in the year, it was clear to our publisher, certainly, and most of our friends, that something had to be done. I remember I was sitting in the Senate press gallery one morning, and David Rogers from the Wall Street Journal walked over and said, "So, how is the outcome of the election going to affect your book?" And I said, "Oh, no problem. I mean, we're just going to, tinker on the margins, and we'll probably do a big last chapter, one big chapter to deal with it." And there was this pause, and he said, "One chapter?" And then he raised his eyebrow and he said, "Are you sure just one chapter?" As if to say, "Hey, bub, get serious. There's more work in your future than that." That July, Times Books confirmed those. In 1994, when we were only about 4 months away from meeting our contractual deadline to finish the manuscript, the Republicans swept to victory. This was certainly an historical moment. For the first time in 40 years, the Republicans were in charge of the House and the Senate. The contract with America was on everyone's lips. Everyone was talking about Newt Gingrich. The political world had shifted dramatically. But there we were, George and I, exhausted, fed up with the book, and with the finish line in sight. We were determined not to let this dramatic change affect our book too much. We said, okay, sure, we'll beef up the last chapter, and we'll do something more with the prologue and the introduction, and